Aducanumab. Aducanumab. What does this sound like? It sounds like a magical incantation, or perhaps the name of a minor demon in Milton's Paradise Lost. Or for those who are really into binge watching, it could be Mazikeen's younger brother or sister in the series Lucifer, which is on this weekend. It just dropped. But Aducanumab is not a magical incantation, although it may evince magical thinking. It is also not demonic, although it may indeed be deeply delusional. Aducanumab, sold under the brand name Aduhelm, is a drug developed to treat by slowing down the progression, not curing, Alzheimer's disease. It targets aggregated forms of amyloid beta found in the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease in order to reduce its buildup. It was developed by the biotech company Biogen, based across the river in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It was approved for medical use in the U.S. for all patients with Alzheimer's by the FDA in June 2021, but in response to significant controversy, the FDA limited the indication to people with mild cognitive impairment or dementia, the population actually used in the clinical trial. Why the controversy? Well, the drug was approved against the overwhelming recommendation of an outside panel of experts convened by the FDA to examine the evidence before it made the point of approval. And the saga of the drug, in my view, sharply raises issues that American healthcare will need to address in the years to come. And these are issues, I think, that Catholic healthcare ethics may have significant resources to bring to the table. Let's see, where's my slide? So what I'd like to do in this presentation is look at three things. As Pope Francis reminds us, along with Papesalisa, everything is connected. And so I'd like to take one case study, the case study over this controversy over aducanumab, to illustrate how the connections run up and down the line of ethical analysis in the realm of healthcare, from the personal through the familial to the social. And I'm going to do this by looking at three separate parts. I'd like to describe first what happened with the drugs, because I don't actually think you can do ethics unless you enter into the processes that you're claiming to understand and evaluate. Second, I'd like to focus on a notion that's more at home in the economic and the political realm than it is in the theological ethical realm, called regulatory capture. And third, I'd like to intimate, and I can only intimate because of time constraints, how this notion of regulatory capture is ripe for intervention from Catholic social and healthcare ethics. So let's start with looking at what happened. The FDA approval process. It was seriously flawed. As is required with any experimental drug, Biogen put aducanumab through a clinical trial. First, there was a smaller two-stage phase 1 clinical trial designed primarily to test the safety of the drug. Later, there were two large phase 3 clinical trials, 301 and 302, launched in 2015 and designed to test clinical efficacy. The subjects all had mild cognitive impairment due to dementia. Now, on March 21st, 2019, about 4 years later, both clinical studies, 301 and 302, were terminated for futility. The Independent Data Monitoring Committee saw that the trials were unlikely to meet their primary efficacy endpoint on completion. Translated into basic English, that means that the drugs weren't working. They weren't doing what they were tested to do. Now, that should have been the end of things, but it wasn't. It wasn't the end of the story. On October 22nd, 2019, Biogen astonishingly announced plans to go ahead and to seek approval anyway of this drug. It wasn't going to do so on the basis of new clinical studies, in addition to the 2 failed phase 3 studies. Instead, it proposed to do so by rereading and reinterpreting the incomplete data that it already had. So it was going to go back and interpret its results with, let's say, a hermeneutic of charity, which may be appropriate in the context of looking at other people's motives, not so much in a scientific study. But it didn't engage in this rebooting process by itself. It did so by a close collaboration with the FDA. In fact, Biogen and the FDA worked together for over a year to reinterpret the data. Yeah. So, they did this for over a year, and on November 6, 2020, they presented their findings to a meeting of the FDA Peripheral and Central Nervous System Drug Advisory Committee, which was comprised of outside experts. It's safe to say that the committee had an overwhelmingly negative reaction to the unprecedented joint briefing document prepared by the FDA and Biogen together. You've got a regulator and a regulated. The regulated and the regulated presented a document that they concocted together. Again, we're anticipating the eschaton in the wrong way. The lion and the lamb are not supposed to lie down together now. In response to the question whether it is reasonable to consider study 302, which was the positive study, as primary evidence of effectiveness of aducanumab for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease, the committee voted yes, none, no, 10, and 1 undecided. So what were the problems identified by the independent committee? There were 2 sets of problems. The first were procedural problems that can be grouped under the question, who is looking after the watchman? Who is watching the watchman? Quis custodiet ipsos custodes in Latin, because it sounds better. The procedural problem is, in fact, that the primary briefing document was drafted jointly by Biogen and FDA after a series of unprecedented meetings. The Public Citizen Organization, which is a very, very well-respected not-for-profit consumer advocacy group, said, quote, "The close collaboration that occurred between the agency and Biogen in conducting post hoc analysis of data from the clinical trials, to our knowledge, is unprecedented." But it's not just the procedural problems that are at stake. There are also substantive problems with the results here. Scientifically suspect methodology was identified. Cherry picking. Tristan Massey, the mathematical statistician for the FDA, said, if one has 2 studies and takes the best and pretends like it's the only study, one's estimate is most likely biased and misleading. It is not justifiable to search for patients in 301 who are similar to 302 because that may have selection bias and presume that 302 is right and 301 is wrong. A second problem is that, is that the good study wasn't all that good. Dr. Massey said as well that inconsistency on many levels summarizes the final clinical efficacy data from these trials. Because the 2 phase 3 studies were terminated for futility, the package doesn't even contain a single phase 3 study that was fully completed according to plan. You've got 2 terminated studies for futility. One came out slightly better than the other, and the FDA says, let's just look at this one. There is a strong argument, in addition, that the difference in the 2 studies could have been related to the placebo in both studies. A worse placebo response in study 301 than 302 could explain the results. What does that mean in English? Well, if you start with a lower base, your growth seems a lot higher when you're comparing the effectiveness of the drug. Again, with apologies to Megan Trainor, it is all about the base. Another problem is really how much clinical benefit came from the study. The clinical benefit in Alzheimer's drugs is measured by something called the Clinical Dementia Rating Sum of Boxes. In essence, what it does is it stages Alzheimer's from a 0 to an 18 scale according to severity. The statistical improvement from the 302 study was 0.39 on an 18-point scale, or 2% improvement. When you take into account that these clinical studies are not totally objective on their own, but also look at impressions of improvement, it's not particularly clear that this was really a significant result, although the FDA described it as such. And then there is finally a confusion about basic questions. Many of the scientists seemed quite certain that the drug did effectively target amyloid beta proteins rather. But the question really is, does reducing amyloid beta proteins in the brain, kind of a chemical question, actually translate into reduction in Alzheimer's symptoms, which is a clinical question? Dr. Scott Emerson, MD, PhD, oh my goodness, I've got 2 minutes left, said that this analysis seems to be subject to the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, a name for the joke of someone first firing a shotgun at a barn and then painting a target around it for the bullet holes, to say you shoot first and then claim you got your target. So I've only got 2 minutes left, and I've got about 25 minutes of presentation. So actually, this is not going to work. So I just want to say 2 things about the next 2 sections of the paper that I'm not going to deliver. What Public Citizen and a lot of other critics of this FDA approval process said was, what was at stake here was something called regulatory capture. How come it's not moving? Regulatory capture is a situation, David Hollenbach talked about it before, when the regulators, instead of protecting the public good, actually protect their own interests and the interest of the industry that they're regulating. This is a topic that came up, that has been talked about a lot in the economics literature. It's often associated with economic analysis of law, and it's often associated with a very conservative approach to regulation. If the regulators are captured, then why do we have regulation in the first place? Let's just get rid of the regulators. But in recent years, the discussion of regulatory capture has moved into a much broader political and social context, retrieving connections with Aristotle and with other great political theorists. And there's become more openness in, I think, the field as a whole to connect with Catholic Catholic political theory and social theory. The PowerPoint seems to have died. I don't know why. So what I would like to suggest is that one way in which we can honor some of Lisa's insights about the connection between the personal and the social is by focusing on this concept of regulatory capture. But because what we see here is that individual decisions and individual virtues of the regulators, their desires, their misperceptions, their intellectual virtues and vices, make an enormous difference for the common good. And so focusing on, one, what counts as the public interest with regard to drugs such as this. It costs $29 million, more than any other drug that Medicare is funding. We could focus on this, but we can also look at institutional virtue and vice, personal virtue and vice, and in particular, the nature and distortions of friendship. Because it strikes me that underlying the modern problem with regulatory capture is a distorted notion of friendship between those who are regulated and those who are regulating. They prioritize their relationship with one another over their responsibilities to everyone else. And I see this as really a leading edge problem at the intersection of economics, the common good, and personal and social ethics, with great effect on families and individuals. And I think that if we want to pursue this in a more sustained way, we would make great use of the insights of Lisa Cahill and more broadly, Jim Keenan, Dan Daly, Kristen Heyer, many of the ethicists in this room. So I will shut up now. Thank you.